Hey everybody, I'm Jesse. Welcome to my talk. And we're going to talk about using React Native to build not just mobile apps, but also web apps and desktop apps. So One Codebase for all of this. So when I came up with the name for this talk, I thought it was really clever. One Codebase to rule them all, right? But then I was in a meeting and somebody else, when I told them about using React Native cross-platform, they were like, One Codebase to rule them all. I'm like, no, like I put that on my talk, like it's submitted. You could see I did it first. And then I found somebody on Medium wrote an article and it had the same title like last year. So evidently I'm not as unique as I thought. But anyway, still a cool title. So I'm Jesse. I'm a senior software engineer at Dick's Sporting Goods. I started there in November. Before that, I was a front-end engineer. Before that, I was a freelancer. And before that, I had a bunch of other non-coding jobs. I also volunteer as a live coder for Free Code Camp. If you want to know more about that, I just gave a talk on that, like on the 2:15 slot. So that'll probably be on the YouTube channel at some point, so you can check that out as well. I always put the thank yous at the beginning because if I leave them to the end, sometimes I run out of time or forget. So I want to thank my wife's parents for watching my 4 kids so that my wife and I could come up here. And I also want to thank everybody here at StirTrek, organizers, volunteers, attendees. This has been a really cool conference. This is my first time at StirTrek. And I've been to a good number of conferences, and this is really impressive. So y'all did a really good job. All right, so I have no idea what the skill level is for this audience in regard to React Native, so I'm going to start really basic. I pulled this right from the React Native website. Okay, so it's a framework for building native apps. Okay, so you can use React, which is a JavaScript library, and with some small differences, you can use JavaScript to build iOS and Android apps, which is really cool. If you come from JavaScript world, then you can build apps. And this is not like a web view. This is actually like native code. It ends up being native code. You can sync up with hardware on the device, so really lets you do a lot without having to learn to write, what is it, like Kotlin or Swift or whatever is the thing that you normally use now on Android and iOS. All right, so if you know React, then you probably know a lot about React Native. There are a few differences. I'm not going to talk about them all, but just from the developer's point of view, the biggest difference is you can't use DOM primitives. So when you use React, you can use basically everything that's available in HTML. So your div tags, spans, p tags, h1s through h6s, and all that stuff. You can't use that on React Native. Phones don't understand those tags. So React Native has its own set of primitives, right? So instead of a div, you would use a view, right? You would also use a view instead of a span. You basically use a lot of views in React Native. They can be used for a lot. Also, instead of a p tag or h tag or anything that would normally hold text, you use the text tag in React Native. And there's a lot more and more complex ones. Like there are special tags for certain types of inputs, special tags for like modals and things like that. But the JSX portion, so the portion where you're actually using the tags, and if you don't know React, like the JSX is basically the portion that looks like HTML in a React file. That can't be reused between React and React Native, because of the difference in the primitives. But the lifecycle methods and almost all of the rest of the stuff outside of that render method, the JSX, you could reuse. It has all the same lifecycle methods. React Native is slightly behind when it comes to the latest features. So React Native didn't get React hooks until recently. There's some features of the context API that still don't work in React Native. So you just have to be careful about those. But the majority of what you can use in React, you can use in React Native. All right, but that still means you have to have two different code bases, right? You'd have to have React for your web app, and even though you could share a lot of logic, you still can't share everything. So you end up having two completely different projects. But what if you could have one? What if you could take the React Native stuff, right, and have your text tags, you know, and your view tags automatically just get changed into something that a browser can handle? That would be awesome, right? Then you could have one code base. Okay. So why would you want one code base? Okay. So you have less code, right? You don't have to build as much code. You don't have to maintain as much code. That's pretty cool. So you could do more. You could do it faster, because you can build more with less. Okay. You have fewer languages to learn, right? It's just JavaScript. So you just need to know JavaScript, and you know a little bit about how you use JavaScript with React Native, and now you can build for 3 platforms. And if we add in desktop, which we'll talk about a little later on, now that's 4 platforms. And if you really want to make it sound awesome, you could say like Mac, Windows, and Linux, and that gives you 7 platforms. Don't test me on my math, though. I think that's 7. So you can do a lot, and think about that. That's one code base, and you've just hit web, and I mean, sorry, but this is probably not going to work in any Internet Explorer, but other than that, like most modern browsers can run your app, iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows, and Linux. That's actually 6. 6 platforms. So 6 platforms, and 90+% of the code is entirely reused. There's going to be some stuff that'll be specific to a certain platform, right? There's some things you can only do in a browser or only do on a phone. For instance, like on a browser, you can use local storage, but there is no local storage on a phone. But you can use something called async storage, and the API is pretty similar. So like, you would just have a little if statement. If we're on a phone, use async storage. Otherwise, use local storage, right? So you're going to have a little bit of that, and depending on what your app does, you might have more or less of that. Oh, I forgot to put this on here, but potentially you could have fewer developers, right? Which may or may not be a good thing, right? Like if you're the dev that doesn't get hired or gets fired, then that's not good. But if you're trying to manage a team in a project, or you're trying to pitch this in your organization, right? Before, potentially you could be looking at a web team, an Android team, and an iOS team. Let's just forget about desktop for now, because it could potentially be a whole other team for that. Now you're looking at one team. Okay? You may want to have somebody who knows a lot about mobile on your team, just in case you run into any stuff that like is really tricky on a phone, because you can always, with React Native, kind of drop down into native Android or iOS code and add something in if it doesn't already exist in React Native, which is a cool feature. But basically, like, you just don't need as many developers. Okay. All right, so how would we do this? And there's not just one way to do it. We actually have a couple options to make React Native work in a web browser. We're going to talk about the first option. This happens to be the option I have the most experience with, I've actually built things with, but I have done a lot of research on some of the other options, so we'll talk about some other stuff too. But React Native Web takes most of what you can do in React Native and converts it into something the browser can use. There are certain components in React Native that can't be used on a browser. Sometimes it's just because that particular thing doesn't exist in the browser at all. Like it's something that just happens on a phone. Like a shake gesture on a phone is not ever going to translate into a browser, right? Like you directly have a camera, you have like gyroscope stuff. So you just have different sensors on a camera that you're not going to have in a browser. So obviously those can't be converted. All right, but there's some weird things like a modal can't be automatically converted. So in that case, you'd have to do a workaround or something. But basically, most of what you would need, it can just be converted over. So you use the React Native stuff, and if we have time at the end, I'll show you real code where it's using this, and hopefully it'll be clear when you see the code. This definitely has the largest community. So it's been around for a while, a couple years. I have a slide later on where we'll see all the projects that are using this in production. And if you type in on Google and you need some help for React Native Web, you find a large amount of answers, which is awesome. Okay. It also has Expo support. It's coming. So if you are familiar with React Native, you're probably familiar with Expo. If you're not, think of Expo like, I'm trying to think if there's what's comparable. Well, let me just explain it. So Expo like scaffolds your React Native app. It gives you a bunch of extra components on top of what React Native provides to do cool things with your app that normally you would have to write yourself or bring in another package, right? Like, for instance, Expo is a barcode scanner. So if you want to be able to scan a barcode with your camera's phone, it's there. It's already in Expo. You just bring in barcode scanner, and it works. That's not the only thing. They have a ton of stuff. They also have DevTools, and this is why I like Expo better than even any of the components. Their DevTools are awesome. It allows you to run your app, your mobile app, on your machine, and then download the Expo app, like on your Android phone or iOS phone, and then connect so you can actually use that app while you're developing it on a device. As long as you're on the same network, you can use it on the device. Like, I mean, I don't know what restrictions are in on this network, but potentially, like, I could run an Expo app. I could run Expo on here, and if all of you are on the same network, you could all be in, and I could see the error message, the error logs from all of your devices. It would show up and say, like, Tom's iPhone, and Brian's Android, and there would just be a screen where I could see all that, and it's actually really useful. It's really cool. And it provides you with some cool DevTools experience that's more like what you would find on a web. Mobile debugging is sometimes difficult depending on the tools you have, and it can be taxing on your machine. Expo kind of makes that a little bit easier, especially if you're coming from the web dev world. When I say it's Expo support is coming, like, I'm currently using Expo with React Native Web. It works. It's just technically not supported. But there's a branch out there with support. It's very developed, just kind of waiting for it to be like officially there. But there are ways to make it work, and it's not hard. What's that? It's imminent, yeah. I'm trying to think what the dude's name is. His last name is Bacon. I can't remember his first name. But he's kind of like in charge of the branch that's doing that. And so I keep up with the updates, but it's done enough that you can actually use it. Yeah, it'll be there. Yeah, it seems like it's pretty close. All right, the next one is React XP. Okay, so React XP was developed by the Skype team at Microsoft. Okay, so Skype is using React XP. So React XP is a little bit different. I don't want to go under the hood too much for two reasons. One, it's not that exciting, and two, I don't fully understand it. But whereas React Native Web, it like aliases things in React Native and converts them to DOM, like DOM primitives. React XP is an extra layer on top of React Native, and it takes a smaller subset of React Native and allows you to use it. So you're more limited in the components that are guaranteed to work cross-platform, but it seems to be more secure. Like, if you limit yourself to just what React XP offers, you can be pretty sure that it's going to work. React Native Web, you may encounter more bugs. It's not that it's not going to work, but it's just a little bit more buggy, potentially. Okay, so it's a trade-off. React XP does allow you to use all the other stuff that React Native gives you. So it's not like you're fully locked into that, but you just won't have that same guarantee that it's going to work. You would have to say, okay, I want to use all this other React Native stuff, but that functionality is not going to be available in my web app. Right? So it limits you in that way. It's obviously enough to run Skype with, though. So it's a decent amount. It's also built with TypeScript. So if you're a TypeScript person, that might be a big benefit to you. I'm not really into TypeScript. Not that I don't like TypeScript, I just haven't really learned it yet. But from what I understand, the IntelliSense stuff is a lot better with React XP if you're using TypeScript with it. So that could be a big bonus if that's where you're at. Let's see. The next one, and this is the coolest one, but unfortunately it is not done yet. But I'm just putting it in here because it would be really awesome if this actually gets finished. So this has some advantages over the other methods in that it gets down like into the fundamentals and changes things more than any of the other ones do. So from their GitHub page, it says, do not use this in production. It is definitely experimental. It has a very small subset available to use. So it's really, other than just some little demo projects, you can't use it. But it has some really awesome stuff. So multi-threading, you can use the same bundler for mobile and web. So like currently, with both React XP and React Native Web, like you have like your Webpack stuff that's going to bundle all your web app things, and then you're going to use most likely Metro Bundler, which it works under the hood with just plain React and with Expo, so you're probably going to use that either way. But with React Native DOM, it would be one bundler, one kind of pipeline, one set of tools for both, which is pretty cool. Also has layout parity. So what can happen sometimes is you would have slight differences in your styles, in your layout between React Native on a phone and React Native in a browser. So what React Native does is it uses something called Yoga to convert like Flexbox layout stuff and what looks like CSS into stuff that a phone can use. But that same conversion it's not 100%. But with React Native DOM, they use WebAssembly and Yoga, and I don't know exactly how they make this work, but they use it all to make sure that the styles are exact, they match. And that's really cool. I haven't had a ton of issues with layout issues with React Native and React Native Web, but they do exist in that on a large project, it could be potentially a big headache if you have to have multiple layouts for web and for mobile. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about desktop apps. You can definitely do desktop apps. So just think about it. If you can make a web app, you can wrap it in Electron and you can run it, right? Electron lets you do web apps on a desktop. So Electron is definitely an option here. You would just take that same bundle that you built for the web and then run Electron to bundle it again, right? And you could push that out to whatever desktop environment you want. Also, React XP is working on a way to skip the Electron thing and render straight to a Windows app with the universal Windows platform. So like Windows 10 is, I haven't really done much with it, but there is a project inside Microsoft that right now lets you take web apps and make them Windows 10 apps. So what React XP is trying to do is integrate that project into Windows XP so you can just go straight to a Windows app. So that's kind of cool. I don't know exactly where that's at. And so if you're into that, like check it out. It's an open source project, so I'm sure they would welcome help on that. Same thing with React Native DOM. The more people that can work on that, the better. All right. All right, so here's who's actually using this. And I was kind of surprised to see who's really using this because I haven't heard that much about it. I mean, like, I use it, but Twitter is using this. So Twitter's mobile site, so if you go to twitter.com on your phone, you're going to get React Native Web. If you go to Uber, and I'm trying to think, it's not the main Uber app. It is the app that Uber Eats gives to restaurants so that they can do stuff with Uber Eats. Right, so that whole interface is done in React Native Web. Major League Soccer does it with React Native Web. So there's actually been several talks at some big conferences from people who have worked at Major League Soccer, and they talk about their whole process. So if you're interested in how that would work at a large company, you could check that out. Peggy Reyes used to work there. I know she's given some talks, and I can't remember. There have been some other talks about it, but I remember watching some of her talks. And it's interesting how the process that they went through to do that. Okay. Some other stuff that may not be as well known, but still you can check it out. DataCamp, Flipkart. I already mentioned Skype uses React XP. So basically all these are React Native Web except for the last two, Skype XP and Monorail, which I had to double check the spelling because I just kept wanting to say monorail, but it's actually Monorail. And there are no, to my knowledge, there are no examples of something actually in production using React Native DOM. All right, so if you want to see more of this in action, I'm going to give you a preview here as well, but I've been live coding a React Native web app. So all the work I do on it, I live code, usually like twice a week for about an hour at a time. So you can check that out. The Free Code Camp YouTube channel is where I do it, and the repo, it's all open source. So it's just a very basic math game for children, like talking like single digit addition, right? So I just wanted something basic. The idea is just to showcase how you would go about doing that. So we're still in the early stages. We're only in web app mode. I'm trying to wait until Expo finally, like, officially supports things to also do the mobile, and then the next step would be to release it for desktop. So if you want to check it out, feel free to check it out. The recordings are all available too. You don't have to actually catch it live, but we're going to check out that project in action here in a few minutes. Let's see. All right, cool. So let's check it out. This is my last of the slides. We're going to switch to the demo now. But I do want to say, like, if you don't get a question in here, feel free to contact me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on, like, all the social media stuff. So whatever you're most comfortable with, just let me know, or email, or if you can find my phone number, you can text me, I guess. I won't answer, but you can leave a message. You can find my phone number. People have done it. So. All right, I think I have this set up. Okay, let me show you some code first. Let's make that bigger. Can anyone not see that? All right, we're good. Okay, so I just want to start out with the package JSON. You can see this is really simple, okay, and we have React for the React DOM, and React Native Web. Okay, we also have React scripts because we use Create React App to build this. So Create React App is very helpful, so it's awesome that you can utilize that for this project. It basically saves you from having to do any Webpack config yourself, which I'm not great with Webpack, so that's a big bonus for me. But you can see we don't even have React Native in there. So React Native Web is actually going to pull in React Native for us, and it's going to handle all of that. Okay? So we brought that in. This project is so small, it's just a few files, really. There's one main component. We haven't even broken it out yet. But you can see I'm importing things from React like normal, so obviously you can use normal React stuff. We're using the new context API, so that's kind of where this stuff comes from. And we're importing things from React Native, right? So we can import straight from React Native even though we technically don't have it in our package JSON because it's a dependency of React Native Web. So we're bringing in all these React Native components, and I'm going to skip down to the JSX part of things because that's really what's unique here. And we could see in our render function, we have views, we have text components, we have this picker component. All right, we don't have anything that looks like it could work in the DOM. A text input component, we have a button component that I think I skipped by. We have this touchable opacity component, which basically does the same thing as a button, but it lets you style it however you want. And we have our styles. I will point out here that notice all the units, all the numbers are unitless. That's something unique. You don't put units in, but the units get added when you add it, when it does convert to a web app. Okay? And all the positioning is done with Flexbox, which is also unique. It's unique to React Native that you have to use Flexbox. All right, so let's see what this actually renders to in the DOM. So I'm going to run this. Where am I at? All right, so we can run this with Yarn. My presentation's on port 3000, so it's going to be mad. Yeah, let's do it on another port. And this popped up on my other screen. What I really want to show you is DevTools anyway, so let me open DevTools. I'm going to pop DevTools out into a separate window so that we can see more of it. I will show you the actual app just so you know I'm not messing with you. So here's the app, super ugly. But basically the idea is if you get the answer wrong, if you get the answer wrong, you get more enemies on this side. And here's the hero character. So and they're just squares right now. If you get it right, they go off. And I mean, we have even better looking styles for each mode. So yeah. I definitely welcome pull requests from people who are good at design. All right, but here is what we get in DevTools. Let's make that so much bigger. Okay, but we see, look, there are divs, and there's a select. So where we saw that picker element before, it becomes a select when it comes over to the DOM. Lots of divs. So many divs end up being created here, but let's try to find, and you can see it's, there's often a concern with accessibility when you're doing so much conversion like this, and you can see we still have like this ARIA label, which matches up with what we gave it in here. So we put an accessibility label. I didn't actually put this, it just got copied and pasted from the demo. So that's why it says learn more about this purple button. But our accessibility label there would not only work for whatever the accessibility needs are for a phone, but it also translates over here to an ARIA label. I don't know if the accessibility is perfect, but when it comes to accessibility, like doing as much as you can is better than not doing anything. So there's a lot that actually does happen without really any extra work. And yeah, so you can see even like this element in React Native was touchable opacity, but over here it gets turned into a div, and then like there's basically like a click handler on this div. So this is like the outer container of the button, and this would just have the text of the button. So we just have nested divs. Okay, so obviously, like it works. We've definitely written it in React Native, and we're pulling in, sorry for the scrolling, we're pulling everything in from React Native, but it ends up being working in the DOM. And we end up getting CSS. Like all of this looks like CSS if we check out our component here. So all of those, in a similar way that happens when you do React and you do your styles as a JavaScript object, right? It also converts to regular styles. But like I said, you're not putting units there, but the units get added. And your Flexbox stuff works as well. One other caveat to React Native, Flexbox, by default, the orientation is flex direction row on your browser. The default is flex direction column on the web, which makes sense because normally your users are going to have it in portrait mode, but most desktop screens are landscape, right? So that happens. That's a little tricky just to get your head around, but you know, after you code with it for a day or two, you just get used to it. Let's see. Sorry, I lost track of how much time. I don't want to keep you over because I want to make sure you all get good seats for the movie. Okay. I have to. Sorry, I forget how long I have to. What time now? Oh, nice. Nice. All right, cool. All right, so what I want to do here is, first of all, I want to ask if there's any questions so far. But other than that, we could kind of like dive deeper into like what's going on in the code if we want to. But I don't want to take up all the time and not have questions. So I'll check here. I know there's a Slack channel, so we'll have to check the Slack channel. You got it. So is there anything in Slack? Not yet? Okay, cool. Anybody have any questions so far? Oh, go ahead. Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So I'm going to repeat it because I don't know if the mic can pick it up. But so the question was, in working with Angular and PhoneGap, one of the things that had to be done was making sure that it was responsive. So use the same code that would run on the web and on a phone. And saying, is that kind of what we need to do here? And yeah, the question or the answer is yes. So you would have to make sure that you have a good layout. So that can be difficult, right? So one project that I am working on now, by default, uses a landscape layout because we were primarily targeting tablets. However, that's changing now, and now we've shifted and we're primarily going to target phones. So now it's going to be much harder because, right, that's a whole different ball game. Like, if your landscape, you can, on like an iPad, you can still have things side by side in a desktop environment. So you would need to have, and fortunately Flexbox is pretty good with this. Not only do you need to make it responsive to screen width, but you can detect orientation. So that's one thing you can do in React Native. So not only responsive between browsers, but have different layouts depending on screen orientation. You can potentially lock the orientation and say we want this portrait only or landscape only. So that is an option. Yeah, you'll primarily, it's been my experience usually, like you primarily have like your base, right, and you work off of. So if you're doing React Native, your base is probably the phone, and then as you get bigger, then you work on the layout. I mean, I don't know if it's like that for anybody else, but often, like, you got to start somewhere, right? I find it easier to work with the small layout first, and then I have all this space, and then it's like, okay, now we can do more. If I start with a big layout first and then shrink it down, it's like, oh, what do I cut out of here, right? And you feel like you're giving the users not as good of an experience. But yeah, it is a little bit tricky though, right? Because you're not going to be able to use media queries on React Native, right? Phones aren't going to respond to your media queries. So you're going to have to take that into account. One thing you can do, and I don't think am I doing it here? Let me see. Okay, I am doing this here, right? So you notice, like, we have a CSS file. This will throw an error if you try to bring this in on React Native for a phone. Right? But we can take this CSS file and import it. I don't think I'm doing it yet because we haven't run it on a phone yet, but I need to do it, so let's just do it. So we have this CSS file, right? We would bring it in this index.js, and this is our entry file for web. But what we would do then is have an app.js file that would live out here. So basically, when we decide to make this for mobile, we would have an app.js file that would live at the root of the project, and we would tell that app.js file basically like import React Native and all that stuff, and then we would say import, instead of, like, we would import app from app, so, right? So we're still using the same code, app.js, right? We would, essentially what I normally do is, like, I combine this CSS with the index.css. So the only place we're importing CSS is this index.js. This one has React DOM, it renders to the DOM, and it points to app, so it imports app. Our app.js, which is the entry point when we're building for mobile, bypasses this file, imports app directly, and then the CSS doesn't get imported. So any CSS that's going to be web specific, we can write as plain CSS, which is kind of nice, especially when you're working with media queries, because they're already complicated enough in regular CSS. If you wanted to, you could write it in Sass and set up your config to be able to handle that too. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. But anything that would be browser specific would go in here. So I mean, think like, you're not going to be able to target your HTML or your body in React Native, right? Because those don't exist in React Native. There's a lot of stuff in CSS that just won't work in React Native because the equivalent things don't exist on a phone, right? So React Native for mobile only uses a subset of CSS. So this is where you would want to add like any of the other stuff that would work. Same with like animations. The way you do an animation in React Native is going to be different than the way you do an animation in the browser. So this is one way that you could kind of easily add some web stuff. So that was a long answer to your question, and I think I went off track a little, but that was a good question. All right. All right, any other questions? Sorry, I keep looking at you for the stuff, but it's him. I keep forgetting it's you. All right. You said check the Slack? I don't know if there's anything on Slack.
How do you connect to backend services and or data with React Native?
Okay, great. Yeah, this is, let's see. All right, I'm not connecting with anything on this app, unfortunately. I have another app I'm using that I can't show you because it's for work, but we're connecting to a lot of services. So I'm not going to assume that you're familiar with React, so I'll just kind of go through it from the start. But if you are familiar with React, it is very similar. So you can use the Fetch API in React Native. It'll still work, right? So as you normally would in React, you would use Fetch API. If you're not familiar with that, like think of like what Ajax does if you're using jQuery or an XHR request. So it's a network request. You would use Fetch. You could use promises. You could use async await. You'll probably need to use Babel. to transpile that so that you can use it, but it's still, like I'm using it and it works. So you would just do fetch to do a normal request to a service. Like I'm assuming it has a REST API. Okay? Potentially you could use GraphQL if you wanted to as well. All right, so you do your request. The code is exactly the same whether you're doing the request from a phone or from a browser. So that's actually really awesome. Now what you do with that data after might be different. So if you have some type of local storage of that data, it could change. Like if you're going to use something like Redux, it could probably be the same. Redux will work. But if you're going to use something like browser local storage, which I think I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to switch it up a little bit because the API for async storage is slightly different. I believe local storage, though, still will work if you use Electron. So if anybody knows differently, let me know. But I'm pretty sure you can still use local storage as is if you use Electron. But the actual calls will still work. It's still just JavaScript fetch and promises. I mean, I guess that is kind of strange because the fetch API is a browser API, but whatever is happening with React Native still allows you to use that. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but in terms of implementation, it is the same. Behind the scenes, probably different. Oh yeah, DevTools. I wish, that's a really good question. I wish I had converted this project already. We're using parts of the context API that aren't yet supported in Expo, so I couldn't convert it already. But basically, what would happen for DevTools is you would run it, and you could run, like if you're on iOS, or I'm sorry, Mac OS, you could run the iOS simulator that comes with Xcode and see your app right there, and then it would open up a new window, and then you could inspect that window and have the same DevTools come up. Right? And there are also even more advanced tools, which I don't think I have installed on this machine, but like if you're using Redux, there's actually a tool you can download that essentially is just DevTools, but it looks like an Electron app. I think it probably is. But it's DevTools, and it'll show you all your Redux store. If you're familiar with the Chrome Redux DevTools extension, it works basically the same way, but it's for React Native. It allows you to like see all the network requests going in and out. So the DevTools experience is very similar to what you would see on the web. And, all right, cool. I was told not to step outside this box. So
There's a shot collar.
yeah, I don't want to know what happens if I step outside of the box. Okay. So Chris is asking, divs as buttons is an example of non-semantic markup. All right, this is a good question. I know where it's going. Not only will accessibility be inadequate, it could be improperly executed. Does React XP do a better job at mapping components one-to-one? Would it create an anchor or button from the opacity thing? And there's a second question which I'll read next. But yeah, so that's a really good question. And this hits again on the accessibility thing, right? So much of accessibility on the web is based on semantic markup. So like there are things in HTML that have that markup. And I would say to this, if we're going to go down the route of a universal like component system that will work on mobile, desktop, web, then we got to rethink how we do accessibility. So I wouldn't argue that the best way to do accessibility on the web is to use the HTML components as intended. But if the goal is to move towards something that is more universal, then we have to say, okay, how are we going to do this? Okay, and that might be, okay, well, why don't we convert things like buttons to their HTML equivalent, okay, which I think is good. Or it could be, what about those attributes, like that ARIA label? What if we go all with like ARIA stuff and just move away from all the different semantics? So I am not an accessibility expert, So I'm not going to pretend like I know all the answers to this. But I do think like a decision has to just be made by, I don't know. I don't know who's going to make it. The community just needs to have a discussion about where do we want to move? Do we want to have a more uniform approach to accessibility that could be applied to one place and could work everywhere? Do we want to have them? Because accessibility is very different on different platforms right now. So I think that's a bigger question, and that is a good point. To be honest, I think the best short-term solution would be to try to submit an issue to React Native Web and see if we could change how that works. But longer term, I think there could be a better discussion about, does it even make sense that we're using DOM primitives that were developed in the 90s for the web as it works today? Like, should we move away from that and not rely on those anymore? And they were made in the 90s, and they weren't made for accessibility in the 90s. They work now, but, so anyway, that's like a whole nother topic, but I think it's important that we just decide one way or another and go with that. Okay. The second question from Chris is, will all Redux implementations still work in React Native? I'm not going to say all because I'm not 100% sure, but Redux implementations should work in React Native in the same way. If there may be some edge cases I don't know about, but as far as I know, it should work. We have another question from Chris. How does React Native handle window references? Okay, yeah, so if you're referencing the window, so I assume what you're talking about is like when we do like window.local storage or something. You can't use window references in React Native. So that would be an example of a piece of the code that you'd have to wrap in an if statement to say, if you're on the web, do window dot whatever. Otherwise, do this other thing that works with React Native. So yeah, that's a good question. Anything that is like a DOM. So for that, in that same vein, I believe anything that's like document dot will also not work. But you can see, you can use in React Native, it's platform. So if you can just import it from React Native, it's called platform. Platform.os will let you know what operating system you're on so that you could very easily write code that is specific for iOS, Android, or web. That's it for this one. I don't know if, yeah, and you can actually write, so like let's say we wanted to have a different app.js for web and iOS and Android. We could actually do app.ios.js and app.android.js. And what will happen is if we build for iOS, it will just use the iOS file. If we build for Android, it'll just use the Android file. It'll just default to the normal file, so we'd still leave an app.js for web. So you don't have to do all if statements. You could just name it. And then when we go to import it, like since we're importing it here in our index.js, all we would do is leave the import as is. So we don't have to have like conditional logic in our imports, which is actually not easy to do. It will know which one to pick up. So that's actually useful. Sometimes it's actually easier to just make a new component, make versions of a component than to put all that if statement stuff inside your React component. But I've found that's like minimal. I've been able to use most of the code. I want to say 90+% of the code will work for both. No? All right. Anybody else have a question here? Go ahead. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So it'll do that. It actually, when I've worked with Expo to run the apps, it just like run them locally with the live reloading and stuff when you work on it. It takes care of that then. So I do believe that a build happens and a bundle is done. Like it's honestly beyond me how Expo manages to get that all bundled and live reload an actual mobile app and display it. But at somewhere in that stage, it'll do it as well. So even when you're doing local development, it still picks the right file. All right. Any more questions? We good? All right. Cool. I'm torn here because we have 10 minutes left. I could show you more of the code, or I could give you a little break so you can get good seats. All right, you got good seats? Fine. Let's go. All right. That's right. All right, sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. We're in a theater. It's weird to be in a theater. Like I'm not looking at the screen, so. All right, cool. So let's check out. If anybody has any questions, just yell and I'll answer them. But let's pull in our app.js file, and let me show you the GitHub repo. Yeah, feel free. If you got to go get a seat, like, feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to do a little coding here. I'm going to bring the repo up and actually check out what issues I have, and let's do something real. All right, so one issue we have is a user doesn't know if their answer is correct or incorrect. If they get it right, it just takes away or adds an enemy. So we want to give the user a little bit more of a fun experience if they get it correct or incorrect. So first thing we need to do is add an element to the DOM. So we're already putting in, see where we want to put it. So I say it should go above the problem here, right? That makes sense. That should be an easily visible area. So here's our text input. Here's our numbers. So we have this math container, and we have our math row. I say we make another row. So this is a view. You have to remember, this is going to change into a div. Okay. And, oops. There we go. All right, now inside of our view, we're going to put text. One thing about React Native, you can never just put text by itself. I couldn't have a view and just write some text. It'll throw an error. Every bit of text has to be within a text component. Like even like when we did this button here using touchable opacity, I still had to have a child that said that was a text element. All right, so our text is going to be, let's say, great job. It'd probably be cool to have a bunch of random encouraging messages show up. But for right now, let's just hard code this. And I'm going to save it just to see where it shows up on the page without any styling at all, or if it shows up. Which this is a really cool thing. When you're first beginning development, it is way faster to use React Native Web just because of the speed. You don't need to worry about having an emulator on your computer. It uses way less resources on your machine. So until you actually need to get into the device-specific stuff, this speeds up your development because it's just the web, it's just the browser. All right, let's pull this over. All right, cool. So we have great job right there. Let's do the logic first and then the styling after. So what I want to do is show or hide this based on a certain condition. Let's see. We could probably add something. Where is my, oops, looking in the wrong file. Let's go to our reducers. Okay, so we have all of our logic has been like taken out and put into these reducers. So it's using the context API, which essentially is being used in a somewhat similar way to what you would use Redux for. It's a newer thing in React, and it's very new to React Native. So right here, we're checking for the answer. And we're either adding an enemy or removing an enemy. So this is where we really want to update. So let's see, type add enemy. It's kind of a little like live coding preview of what I do on my live coding. Like literally we just dive right in. Okay, so we have types. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I assume we'll probably need to add a new. There's also a problem when you only look at this like twice a week. You have to relearn your stuff all the time. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. State. Let's say correct. Yeah. 5 minutes? Awesome. All right. 5 minutes. 6? Question. Yeah, that is true. I need to. Yeah, you're right. I'm just wondering, do I have, so I have an action that adds or removes an enemy. Where is that at? Value 1, value 2, but I don't have, I'm just trying to see where I'm keeping track of the number, there we go, number of enemies. So I have a number of enemies, just trying to think. I like that idea, because then I wouldn't have to add more state. So I got to think of a way that I can say the number of enemies increases, the number of enemies has decreased. I'm just not sure. Yeah, all right. If anybody can think of a way to make that work without adding state, let me know, because that would be cool. But otherwise, let's just add some state. So we will go state and. Oh no. Did it die? Yeah, it's not. Oh well. I'll talk louder. And yeah, he said up front, I need to talk loud enough so the other theaters can hear me. Oh, did it work? Hey, awesome, it works now. I might have to abandon this. We might run out of time. It is a cliffhanger. All right, so we have correct is true. That's about as far as we're gonna get because I'm at it right. I only have like a minute, right? 3. Oh, 3 minutes. Oh, we got this. 3 minutes. Set it to null. That's true. I kind of wanted to have it show up first, just so like I could see if it worked. But you're right. It should probably be null or false. All right. So let's see. We need to pass in. Export const initial state. Let's pass in an initial state. Actually, let's just do this just to test it. We can have an initial state of correct, and let's say true. And then we can just manually change it just to make sure that our logic is working for the UI. So in app.js, now let's just add, if I can find where I put this. Great job, there we go. All right, let's jump into JavaScript mode. So in React, if we put these curly brackets in the middle of our JSX, it says, hey, we're about to do some JavaScript, and we're gonna do a ternary here that just says state this state, oh, initial state, and correct. So if that's true, we're going to show it. And we'll do this little like short circuit thing here. So it should show it. Otherwise, it just won't do anything. So let's actually view this. No, cannot read property initial state. Well, you know what? The autocomplete told me that I should use it. What am I calling it? 1 minute? All right, cool. I just got to look up where else I'm using something from initial state. Enemy. There we go. All right, number of enemies. Wait, I'm using it where I put these. Value 1, value 2. Oh, did I destructure it? I did. Oops, wrong place. All right, now I should be able to just take this out. I should be out. I'm out of time. All right, cool. Hey, but it worked. It worked, and we can change our state. If I could find what component the state was on. We should be able to change our state and have it not work. So let's just do it here. No, it actually didn't work. All right, so I failed. But at least we got to actually use some code. So anyway, thanks, everybody. Enjoy the movie. Reach out to me on the internet if you want.